Welcome to Fundamentals of Movement then. So we're progressing now with sort of probably the second half of the module, looking at fundamental movement skills. So physical literacy we've looked at, and now we're going to look at the basics of fundamental movement. So hopefully by the end of this lecture you will have a good understanding of what are fundamental movement skills, the importance of fundamental movement skills within a primary and secondary school curriculum, the categories that they're separated into, what they actually are, and more importantly, the importance of fundamental movement skills in supporting lifelong physical fitness. Okay, so what I want you to do for this first task, if you spend about 10 minutes on this and then obviously report back to your group or discuss it within your group. So I want you to look at the next 2 or 3 slides, and then from the slides, what is it that fundamental movement skills suggest to you? And then think about, when is fundamental movement skill most important? So look at the slides. What do the slides suggest to you that fundamental movement skill is, and when is it most important? I think if you look at the slides, in particular this slide here, it demonstrates to us that what fundamental movement skill is. Well, it's relevant to young children. It happens in the early part of a young child's development. It's more associated with play, what we call active play or active start. It suggests that it's incremental and progressive, that you build, it's like a building block. You progressively build on blocks of learning and blocks of development. It suggests that you need to acquire one block before you go on to the next one. So I think from the diagrams, from these pictures, we get a good understanding of what fundamental movement skill is and what particular age it is relevant. Hopefully we get an understanding of what fundamental movement skill is not. And I mentioned this to you when we talked about physical literacy. Fundamental movement skill is not physical literacy. And we talked through the definition of physical literacy previously. Physical literacy is about competence in movement. So competence in movement is fundamental movement skill. But physical literacy is also knowledge and understanding and motivation and confidence to become physically active. And physical literacy is lifelong. It's from when you're born to when you die. Whereas fundamental movement skill tends to be more about development when you're a young child. That's not to say you can't acquire fundamental movement skills when you're later, but a young child's ability to develop and acquire fundamental movement skills is best when they're a young child, between the ages of 0 to 12. And as you'll learn from subsequent lectures, we'll talk about why young children at that age, they're like a sponge. They're able to soak up learning and knowledge and movement. So that's the best time for children to acquire those fundamental movement skills. So most important, fundamental movement skill isn't physical literacy. I think one of the key messages around fundamental movement skills, you would have heard terms such as windows of trainability, critical window, critical period, periods of trainability. Yes, young children have what we call critical periods of development or critical periods of trainability. Or you might have heard windows of opportunity. What we've got to be careful of with windows of opportunity is that, the window suggests that a window opens and then it closes. So when we talk about windows of opportunity for children learning fundamental movement, it might say at 7 years of age, this is the best time for a child to acquire this fundamental movement. So the window opens at 7, it closes at 8. So that suggests to people that, right, once it closes, your opportunity to acquire that skill is lost, which isn't necessarily so. What critical periods of development or critical windows of opportunity are, is that at certain times in a young child's development, they are more open to learning, they are more susceptible to learning, they're more susceptible to acquire fundamental movement skills. It doesn't mean that that becomes lost once the window is closed. It just means that their ability to develop that fundamental movement skill might be slightly less. And also what it doesn't take into consideration is that every young child is individual. Whereas one window of opportunity, whilst the literature might say that the window of opportunity opens here for children, it's not going to be at the same stage in every child. That doesn't take away from the point here that a critical window is the first 10 years of life for young children, because of their, what we call their neuromuscular system. So the neuromuscular system is the brain that joins up to the muscle. So young children have the opportunity to switch on all of these movement patterns in the first 10 years of life. And I'll talk about this in more depth later, but if you think of if I use the analogy of a tree, if you nurture the tree and feed it and water it, the tree will grow and grow. Now there might be parts of the tree that don't get treated as well and don't get fed as well and don't get as much water. Now if they don't get fed water, they will start to die. And it's the same with the brain sending messages to all the muscles. If we don't use the muscles and use the patterns, the movement patterns, they get pruned, they die off, they don't work anymore. So it's quite a vague sort of analogy, but it's the same sort of thing. And I'll show you in sort of subsequent sort of lectures that you've got all these movement patterns that that are in the body, that the brain connects to the muscle, and if you don't use those movement patterns, they get pruned off, they die off. So that's why critical window exists in the first 10 years of life. So we know fundamental movement skills acquired during 0 to 12 years of age. So does that mean that starting in sport early and specialising in sport early is the answer to ensuring that young children acquire fundamental movement skill? So, all right, quite extreme, the pictures that I've used, but you can see the little boy doing a weightlifting. Does that mean if I want my son or daughter to become an elite athlete or to acquire fundamental movement skills, if I put them into what we call a specialising environment, that they're going to acquire all of those fundamental movement skills? So for this task, what I want you to think about, why would you encourage young children to specialise in sport? And then I want you to present this back to the rest of the group. So if you had a son or a daughter and you wanted them to specialise in sport, what would be the argument that you would give to suggest why they should specialise in sport?